The silence was the first weapon. It was not the absence of noise, but a purposeful, pressurized vacuum, meticulously engineered to crush the breath out of the person standing in the center of the room. Elara Vance knew the sound of high school, the constant, frantic hum of ambition and hormonal anxiety, the rhythmic scraping of sneakers, the staccato burst of forced laughter. But when she walked into AP History that Monday morning, the usual cacophony had been replaced by a dense, synchronized stillness. Every head turned, and every eye, without exception, was cold, analytical, and utterly dismissive. It was a flawless execution of a social death sentence. She felt the temperature drop, not just physically, but psychically. The air became heavy, thick like wet wool, suffocating her usual light stride. She walked toward her customary desk, third row from the back, near the window, where she could sometimes catch a glimpse of the irrelevant world outside the brick walls of Midwood High.
As she neared the chair, usually occupied by Leo, the quiet artist who sometimes shared his esoteric insights on European history, Leo stood up abruptly, not meeting a gaze, and moved 3 desks forward to sit next to Ryan, Madison Thorne's perpetually amused lieutenant. The scraping sound of Leo's chair was the trigger, the single jarring sound in the perfect quiet. It wasn't just Leo, it was the totality of the action. Elara's backpack, usually light with just the necessary texts and notebooks, suddenly felt like it was filled with lead weights, dragging her down into the pit of isolation. She lowered herself into the vacant spot, the seat next to us now an invisible, untouchable territory. She looked around, searching for a single friendly flicker. Maybe Sarah, who she had partnered with on the recent science fair project, or even Mr. Harrison, the history teacher, who usually maintained a genial, if slightly detached, presence.
Sarah was deliberately studying the chipped paint on the ceiling, a theatrical gesture of avoidance so pronounced it was insulting. Mr. Harrison was conspicuously fiddling with his laptop, refusing to lift his chin until the bell rang. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war, and the opposing army was the entire junior class, 72 students strong, mobilized against one quiet, unassuming girl. The silence was the echo of their consensus. To understand the sheer magnitude of this social annihilation, one had to understand the ecosystem of Midwood High, and specifically the absolute dominion held by Madison Thorne. Madison was not just popular, she was the gravitational center of the school's social universe.
She was stunningly beautiful in an aggressive, high-maintenance way, relentlessly charming when necessary, and possessed of a frightening instinct for detecting and neutralizing perceived threats. Her power was amplified by money and legacy. Her father sat on the school board, a substantial donor whose family name was affixed to the new gymnasium. This immunity rendered Madison untouchable by the administration, giving her a free, unchecked hand to manage the internal politics of the student body with the cold efficiency of a corporate raider. Elara Vance, on the other hand, was irrelevant until she wasn't. Her existence was defined by meticulous scholarship and a quiet avoidance of the spotlight. She was the perennial top student, the recipient of every academic accolade Madison secretly craved. Elara was slated for an Ivy League future that Madison, despite her entitlement and expensive tutoring, could only dream of achieving, and that, ultimately, was the unforgivable sin.
Elara's innate confidence, her ability to thrive without Madison's approval, posed a systemic threat to Madison's carefully constructed illusion of comprehensive perfection. The campaign had started subtly 2 weeks prior, a whisper campaign engineered with surgical precision. It began not with Alara's character, but with her trustworthiness. Madison had initially planted the seed during a lunch break, lamenting in performative shock that the answers to the notoriously difficult chemistry midterm had somehow leaked. She didn't accuse Alara directly, she merely introduced the possibility, framed as a tragedy of justice. It's so unfair that someone who worked hard might get eclipsed by someone who found an unfair advantage, she had sighed, to a rapt audience of followers, letting the suspicion settle on the person most likely to perform flawlessly, Alara. The conflict escalated rapidly. The initial lie, the subtle suggestion of academic dishonesty, was just the foundation.
Madison then introduced the social poison. Elira was not merely cheating, but betraying. The narrative Madison confected was one of deep, almost personal treachery. The most potent lie, the one that cemented the collective turning, was the claim that Elira had secretly copied and subsequently leaked private, embarrassing texts from Madison's phone to a rival school publication. This was ludicrous, of course. Elira didn't even have Madison's number, and she certainly didn't care about the petty dramas of the cheerleading squad. But the sheer outrageousness of the lie, paired with Madison's tearful, convincing performance of profound hurt and violation, made it stick. Teenagers rarely seek truth. They seek compelling drama and an opportunity to belong. By the time the Monday class arrived, the class had been thoroughly briefed, unified, and weaponized. The class wasn't just avoiding Elira, they were actively protecting themselves from her perceived contamination.
This was the mechanism of the conflict, collective self-preservation through exclusion. The development phase of Elira's isolation was a slow, agonizing descent into institutionalized invisibility. Every mundane interaction became a calculated rejection. In the cafeteria, the tables that were normally vibrant hubs of gossip and noise would clear as she approached. If she dared to sit down, a contagious ripple effect would occur, forcing the surrounding groups to gather their trays and relocate, leaving Elira at a vast, empty oak table, a solitary figure in a bustling room. The empty space around her was a louder condemnation than any shouted insult could have been. One day, during a mandatory group project in English class, Mr. Davies, oblivious to the social warfare waged daily in his classroom, assigned groups of 5. When Elira was listed in Group 3, Madison, who was in Group 4, immediately and dramatically raised her hand. "Mr.
Davies, sir," she said, her voice dripping with faux deference. "I think there might be a clerical error. We need to swap Ryan and Alara. Our group needs Ryan's specific research skills for the analysis portion, and, well, frankly, I don't think Group 3 will mind. Their work is usually very independent." The implication was chillingly clear. Alara was incapable of collaboration, likely due to her inherent untrustworthiness. The members of Group 3, Chloe, Ben, and another student named Marcus, all nodded in strained agreement, avoiding Alara's burning gaze. They were sacrificing her to placate Madison, trading a pariah for social safety. Mr. Davies, sensing vague discomfort, but fearing the administrative repercussions of upsetting Madison's delicate sensibilities, simply shrugged and made the switch. Alara was left alone to complete the group assignment, the final humiliating confirmation that she had been designated an unperson.
This was the patent interrupt, the moments where her logical brain insisted that someone would break ranks, that someone would see the absurdity of the situation. There was Leo,
the quiet artist. Elira remembered a brief moment in the hallway 3 days after the campaign started, where Leo had hesitated near her locker. Their eyes met, and Elira saw a flicker of sympathy, perhaps even shame in his expression. But before he could speak, Chloe, Madison's dark shadow, materialized out of nowhere, laying a proprietary hand on Leo's arm and steering him away with a practiced smile that was more threat than greeting. The message was explicit. Neutrality was impossible. Alliance with Elira meant shared exile. The totality of the betrayal was what hurt the most. It wasn't just Madison and her inner circle. It was the entire ecosystem. Even the students who genuinely disliked Madison were too cowardly, too invested in their own futures or their current social standings to intervene.
They preferred the moral discomfort of complicity to the agony of ostracization. The classroom became a cage, the halls a gauntlet of averted eyes and tight, judgmental silences. Every day was a masterclass in psychological torture, designed to break her spirit through the relentless, cold detachment. Elira retreated inward, her world shrinking to the confines of her textbooks and the increasingly loud thrum of her own anxiety. She stopped trying to initiate conversations. She started eating lunch in the library's furthest corner, behind the towering shelves of forgotten classics. Her shoulders began to slump, a physical manifestation of the heavy mantle of collective contempt she carried. She was living evidence of the dark power of mass conformity, the terrifying ability of a group to agree upon a reality that was demonstrably false, simply because it served their collective comfort. But as the days turned into weeks, something profound began to shift inside Elira.
The initial shock gave way to a deep, burning resentment, and that resentment slowly metabolized into something far colder, far more dangerous. They operated on power and fear. Madison had destroyed Elira's reputation, but in doing so, she had also inadvertently freed Elira from the suffocating constraints of trying to belong. When you have nothing left to lose, the rules no longer apply. It was late one Tuesday night, 2 weeks into the total class boycott, that the true turning point occurred. Elira was sitting at her desk, ostensibly studying for a calculus test, when she realized she hadn't genuinely absorbed a single equation. She stared at the reflection in the dark window, the tired eyes, the faint shadows under them, the posture of defeat. And then the fear vanished, replaced by a crystalline, unnerving resolve.
She closed the calculus book. Instead, she opened her laptop and navigated not to her usual academic resources, but to the school's online directory, accessing the public domain databases. She spent the next hour meticulously searching for documents that had no apparent relation to high school studies, records pertaining to zoning regulations for commercial properties, minutes from obscure town planning commission meetings from 5 years ago, and detailed financial reports of local charitable foundations. The climax of this strange, nocturnal research came when she found a specific set of archived photographs related to the construction of Midwood High's new gymnasium, the very building bearing the Thorne family name. She downloaded the files, saving them to a highly encrypted folder, her expression utterly impassive. The defeated girl was gone. Then she composed a single email.
It was addressed only to herself, and the subject line was a cryptic sequence of dates and legal abbreviations. The body of the text was a short, precise list of actions. The last item on the list read simply, "Observe the mechanism of the counterweight." She finally looked up from the screen, the room dark save for the glow of the monitor illuminating a face. The look in her eyes was no longer that of a victim fearing the next blow, but of a strategist planning a highly complex, inevitably devastating maneuver. They had successfully turned the whole class against her, believing they had won. What they failed to grasp was that in isolating her entirely, they had pushed her into a space where she could operate without observation, without hesitation,
and without mercy. The groundwork for the complete reversal had been laid, meticulously and quietly, under the cover of their collective scorn.
The question wasn't if Alara would retaliate, but how catastrophically she would choose to deploy the new knowledge she now possessed. The silent girl had been watching, and now she was ready to make them all pay attention. The story of how Alara Vance managed to dismantle the carefully constructed world of Madison Thorne, leveraging secrets that reached far beyond the hallowed halls of Midwood High, is just beginning. What she discovered in those obscure documents and how she used that information to shift the very tectonic plates of the school's power structure is a complex tale of revenge and unexpected redemption. If you want to witness the moment the hunted became the hunter and see the full spectacular fallout of Alara's counterattack, be sure to continue the journey in the next installment.
The isolation was not a vacuum, it was a pressurized chamber, constantly adjusting its atmosphere to ensure she remained perfectly suspended, unable to breathe the same air as the others. Where the first days had been marked by confusion and the sharp sting of initial rejection, the ensuing weeks settled into a chilling rhythm, a formalized ballet of ostracism choreographed by the invisible hands of consensus. It wasn't just that they didn't speak to her, it was the calculated, elaborate measures they took to demonstrate the width of the gulf between them. This deliberate display of exclusion became the new curriculum, a mandatory lesson in social architecture, taught silently through averted gazes and the strategic placement of empty desks. The classroom itself had become an accomplice. Her desk, once part of a communal cluster, was now an island, surrounded by a perimeter of intentional void. When the teacher, Miss
Davison, mandated group work, the cruelty escalated from avoidance to administrative sabotage. 3 students would scramble to claim a 4-person table, fiercely arguing over who would pretend to work alone, ensuring that when the pairings were finalized, there was no available slot, no accidental adjacency that could force Alara, the poor girl, into the circle. They would actively reject the chance for a higher grade if it meant sharing oxygen with her, a dedication to malice that spoke to the profound success of the core architects of this campaign. This was the terrifying reality of consensus bullying. The mechanism had achieved critical mass, functioning now without constant supervision from the ringleaders. The class, en masse, had internalized the decree that she was untouchable, a carrier of social plague. Even the genuinely passive students, those who possessed no inherent ill will, participated out of a desperate fear of becoming the next target.
They understood that demonstrating their commitment to Alara's isolation was their insurance policy against Marcus and his inner cabal. Their participation was not born of hatred, but of a deep, sickening cowardice, a pragmatic survival instinct overriding any shred of decency. The lunch hour, previously a brief respite, transformed into a grueling psychological siege. She did not sit at a table. She sat near one, always the same one, in the furthest corner of the cavernous cafeteria. The space surrounding her had developed a curious, palpable chill, an acoustic dead zone. She would unpack her thermos and sandwich, the routine a mechanical, meaningless gesture, acutely aware of the microscopic details of every interaction happening nearby that steadfastly excluded her.
The clatter of trays, the bursts of shared laughter, the secrets whispered into cupped hands, all these sounds formed a thick, impenetrable wall, reinforcing the fact that the entire universe of teenage communication was happening just inches away, yet entirely out of reach. One afternoon, the cruelty shifted from the abstract to the tangible, a moment of physical manifestation that solidified the depth of their coordinated animosity. She arrived at a locker after third period to find the metallic surface smeared with a sticky, viscous substance. Not paint, not mud, but something intentionally repulsive, difficult to clean, and positioned squarely over the vent holes. Beneath the residue, scratched lightly into the cheap laminate, was a single cryptic symbol that she didn't recognize, but whose intent was crystal clear. A mark of ownership, a designation of impurity.
It was low-effort vandalism, designed not to destroy property, but to contaminate her personal space, to force her to physically confront their loathing. She spent 20 minutes scrubbing it off with a damp napkin stolen from the restroom dispenser, the shame burning hotter than the friction against the metal. This act wasn't witnessed by the primary aggressors, yet the quiet, observing students passing by offered a silent confirmation that they knew who did it and that they implicitly approved. Their silence was not neutrality, it was ratification. The escalating persecution began to exact a physical toll. The stress was chronic, an unrelenting pressure on her nervous system. She began to suffer from persistent, dull headaches that scented behind her eyes, the result of constant hypervigilance. Sleep offered little relief. The dread of the next school day often woke her hours before the alarm, her mind cycling through preemptive scenarios of humiliation. A mother noticed the change, the spectral pallor of his skin, the refusal to discuss school beyond monosyllabic assurances that everything was fine. But Alara was a master of deflection, a sudden, precocious expert in masking profound emotional trauma behind a facade of quiet studiousness. She knew, instinctively, that admitting the full scope of the class's calculated malice would only result in adult intervention that would be clumsy and ineffective, leading only to greater retribution. The only time the class dynamic was momentarily interrupted was during the mandatory extracurricular sessions, specifically the History Honors Study Group. Here, the weight of academic necessity briefly outweighed social mandate. Marcus, the primary ringleader, needed the highest marks to secure his early acceptance letter. Alara, despite the torment, maintained an almost superhuman capacity for focused study, possessing an encyclopedic recall for dates and treaties. During one such session, Professor Thorne, oblivious to the social warfare waged beneath his very nose, assigned a complex comparative analysis that required meticulous source pooling. Marcus, recognizing the necessity, approached her desk, the only time he had come near her in weeks. The entire room tensed, expecting an explosion, a confrontation. Instead, he maintained a carefully neutral expression, a mask of cold professionalism that was arguably more terrifying than open hostility. "I need your notes on the Treaty of Westphalia," he stated, his voice devoid of tone. "Don't bother summarizing. I want the originals." It was a demand, not a request, delivered as if he were addressing a paid subordinate. Alara looked up, her expression tired but steady. She had anticipated this moment, the inevitable intersection of her utility and their contempt. She simply handed him the heavily annotated folder. "You'll need to cross-reference the secondary sources listed on page 7, she whispered, her voice husky from disuse. Marcus merely snatched the folder, his eyes scanning the detailed margin notes. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped. There was a flicker of something akin to grudging respect, immediately followed by a profound, furious resentment. He hated that he needed her intellect. He hated that her resilience meant she hadn't yet cracked. He pivoted instantly, walking back to his group without a single word of thanks or acknowledgement, the borrowed notes already being dissected and repurposed by his cohorts. The rest of the group watched this transaction with intense interest. It was a momentary pattern interrupt, a break in the persecution, but it only served to confirm the power dynamic. Alara was a useful resource to be exploited, not a person to be acknowledged.
This brief clinical interaction did not humanize her, it codified her role as an academic tool, ensuring the isolation could resume with renewed vigor once her utility had been extracted. The most insidious development, however, lay outside the physical confines of the school. The campaign had moved into the digital realm, transforming the constant surveillance into a persistent and visible pressure. A dedicated group chat, mockingly named something innocuous like the study hall, was operating 24/7, populated by nearly 40 members of the class. This group was the clearinghouse for every rumor, every malicious photo taken from a distance, every screenshot of her poorly spelled social media posts, which she had long since restricted to private viewing, an act that did little to stop the leaks. The objective was simple: perpetual harassment, maintaining the fiction of her unworthiness even when they were physically separated.
A shared image of her sitting alone in the cafeteria would circulate instantly, captioned with cruel assessments of her appearance or mental state. If she walked too quickly between classes, a clip would be posted, analyzed for signs of neurosis or panic. She knew vaguely that this digital shadow existed, the sheer force of their collective consciousness pressing down on her, but the specific, detailed nature of the malice remained just out of her grasp, a terrifying uncertainty that was often worse than explicit knowledge. This relentless pressure culminated in a fragile internal fracturing. One Tuesday, during a free period spent in the library, she found herself staring at the endless rows of books, suddenly overwhelmed by the futility of enduring. The weight of the collective disapproval felt like a physical anchor dragging her down. She stood up abruptly, intending only to go to the restroom, but found her feet carrying her towards the emergency exit near the back loading dock. The air outside was crisp, cold, and blessedly silent. She didn't have a plan. The desire was simply to escape the walls, the gaze, the atmosphere of calculated hostility. She walked past the dumpsters, across the patchy lawn, until she was hidden behind a cluster of maintenance sheds. It was here, crouching low against the brick, that the internal dam finally broke. It was not a loud, dramatic weeping, but a silent, shaking convulsion of pure, exhausted anguish. She didn't cry for the friends she had lost or the reputation that had been destroyed. She wept for the profound loneliness, the knowledge that 40 people had collectively agreed she was worthless, and that no authority figure had the clarity or the courage to see the truth, much less stop it. The shame of hiding, of being reduced to a fugitive on her own school grounds, was the bitterest part.
She remained there for nearly an hour, chilled to the bone, contemplating the terrifying prospect of simply disappearing, of walking away from the life she had known and starting somewhere, anywhere, where her past did not already precede her with a list of fabricated sins. It was the purest form of despair, the realization that the world had judged her guilty and sentenced her to permanent exile, and there was no court of appeals. When she finally gathered the minimal resolve needed to return, the pattern interrupt was subtle, yet profound. As she approached the school entrance, she saw a car pull up, a sleek, dark sedan, not the usual parent vehicle. A figure emerged, an imposing woman in a precise dark suit, carrying a heavy leather portfolio. She looked too professional, too sharply focused, to be a regular substitute or visiting lecturer. The woman did not look around. She walked with an air of absolute purpose, marching straight toward the main entrance.
Elira slipped back inside through the side door, her heart hammering a confusing rhythm of fear and faint curiosity. Who was that? And why did her presence feel like an intrusion of the real world into that carefully constructed microcosm of high school cruelty? The woman had the look of someone who dealt exclusively in consequences. The return to the hallway was instantly jarring. The silence was gone. Instead, there was a palpable tension in the air,
a low hum of nervous chatter, distinctly different from the usual adolescent gossip. Students were huddled in small, anxious groups, their eyes flickering towards the principal's office at the end of the hall, their expressions displaying a mixture of confusion and mountain dread. It was then that Alara overheard a fragment of conversation, a quick, panicked whisper between two girls who had been particularly zealous in their avoidance. "They're talking to Marcus now," one hissed, her face pale, "about the money and the emails."
"No, not just Marcus," the other girl replied, pulling her friend tighter. "It's everyone on the list. That woman is from the district, maybe even higher. They said they have printouts, all of them." Alara stopped dead in the middle of the hallway. The silence she had endured for weeks suddenly felt insignificant compared to the sudden, explosive sound of this revelation. The money? The emails? Her mind raced. The isolation had been so complete that she had entirely missed the shift in the narrative, the underlying structural failure that had begun to crumble beneath the weight of their collective malice. The class hadn't just turned against her. In their zeal to destroy her, they had evidently done something catastrophic, something that had attracted scrutiny far beyond the purview of Miss Davidson's inadequate classroom management.
She understood with a slow, creeping realization that traveled from her exhausted mind down to her trembling fingertips, that the external world, the one she had been so desperate to escape, had finally reached into the confines of their school. The dark sedan, the woman with the portfolio, the whispered fear about the list. This was not about her psychological torment anymore. This was administrative, possibly legal. The architects of her persecution were suddenly exhibiting the exact same fear and panic they had meticulously engineered in her. The atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The tide, slowly, painfully, had begun to turn, not through any action of hers, but through the sheer weight of their own cumulative, unchecked recklessness. And yet, she had no idea what specific transgression had finally brought the hammer down, only that the fragile piece of their shared malice was shattered.
The silence surrounding Elira had long ceased to be the absence of sound. It was an entity unto itself, a living, breathing vacuum engineered by collective human will, designed not just to isolate, but to utterly obliterate a presence from the shared reality at a classroom. It was heavier than any physical burden, a constant, crushing atmospheric pressure that made every breath an exhausting act of defiance. The air itself seemed to crackle with unspent, directed tension, a pervasive psychological noise that only she could hear. The sheer, staggering exhaustion of maintaining a facade of normalcy in the face of this systemic erasure began to manifest physically. Her movements were slow, burdened, as if wading through molasses while the rest of the world effortlessly floated past. Her shoulders, perpetually hunched, became the physical embodiment of the weight of the class's disdain, shielding her heart from blows that, realistically, landed true regardless of her defenses.
Sleep offered no true respite, only fragmented, anxious hours spent cycling through scenarios where she either disappeared entirely or finally found the words to articulate the injustice, words that always failed her upon waking. The bullying had moved past the initial phase of direct confrontation and entered a chilling, masterful phase of sustained neglect. It was the calculated withdrawal of every basic social amenity, the borrowed pen, the casual glance, the acknowledgement of her existence in group work. During mandatory partner activities, when the teacher assigned groups randomly, the other student would inevitably and with practiced ease
find a reason to work alone, citing technical needs, or simply moving their desk away until an insurmountable physical gap existed between them. She remembered one particularly vivid instance during a chemistry practical, an exercise that required 2 people to safely handle volatile liquids.
Her assigned partner, Marcus, a quiet boy usually intimidated by the ringleaders, simply looked at her, his face a mask of miserable terror, and walked to the storage closet, claiming he needed to check the calibration of the measuring cylinder, a task that normally took 30 seconds, and remained there, motionless, for the entire 45-minute period, only emerging when the dismissal bell rang. The teacher, observing the scene, merely sighed, a sound of weary resignation that somehow placed the blame squarely on Alara for creating a situation so awkward that it necessitated Marcus hiding behind safety goggles in a dusty closet. This was the mechanism of their power, not overt aggression, but the quiet, agonizing erosion of her social standing, until her very presence became toxic, a moral contamination that everyone feared.
The system was self-policing. Any student who dared offer Alara a moment of kindness, a shared joke, a fleeting moment eye contact, was instantly subjected to the same chilling, silent treatment. The fear of being outcast themselves proved a far more potent weapon than any direct threat. Alara's internal world, once rich with curiosity and quiet optimism, had retreated into a narrow focus on survival. She developed micro-routines, intricate coping mechanisms that allowed her to navigate the school day. She knew exactly which corner of the cafeteria remained unused, how many seconds it took to walk from her locker to the safety of the empty library annex, and she calculated the distance between her chair and the nearest hostile classmate with the precision of a seasoned cartographer mapping a minefield. Her gaze was almost always fixed downward or focused on the minute details of the environment, the chipped paint on the radiator, the way dust motes danced in the afternoon sun, anything to avoid locking eyes with the judgment that waited there. But the isolation was not absolute. There were eyes on her, always. The eyes of Vanessa, the architect of this social war, and her lieutenants. Their surveillance was a pervasive low-level hum of contempt, ensuring the boundaries were never breached. They didn't need to speak. A snaring glance across the hallway was enough to reaffirm their dominance and Alara's subordinate, exiled status. It was during one such moment of mandated observation, a period where Alara was forced to stand alone by the lockers while the rest of the cohort laughed conspiratorially 20 feet away, that a crack appeared, not in the wall of isolation, but in the narrative itself.
It was almost imperceptible, a pattern interrupt so slight it was easily dismissible as paranoia. In the farthest corner of the classroom, near the seldom-used auxiliary projector, sat a boy named Julian. Julian was new to the school, having transferred 3 weeks prior, mid-semester. He was instantly unremarkable, which in that hyper-social environment made him remarkable. He wasn't quiet in the fearful, frozen way Alara was. He was quiet in a way that suggested profound disinterest in the social hierarchy. He wore thick, unassuming glasses and spent every spare moment meticulously sketching in a large spiral-bound notebook. Initially, Alara assumed he was simply too far down the social ladder to register on Vanessa's radar, or perhaps too awkward to be worth integrating into the cruelty machine. But as days bled into weeks, Alara started noticing a disturbing trend. Julian was watching her. Not with pity, not with malice, but with a detached, methodical intensity.
He wasn't steering, which was a hostile act. He was observing, which was something clinical and unsettling. His gaze would drift from the teacher to the board to the notebook, and then invariably to Alara. If she flinched or made a small, isolated gesture, reaching for a tissue, shifting a weight, Julian's pen would scratch something quick and precise onto his page. At first, she dismissed it as the simple curiosity of the new kid trying to figure out the school's ecosystem. But the pattern became too consistent. If Vanessa delivered a particularly sharp, nonverbal blow, say grabbing a chair right before Alara was about to sit down, forcing her to stand awkwardly until the teacher intervened, Julian's head would tilt slightly, and his pen would fly across the page. He was documenting the architecture of her isolation. He was documenting them. This observation was a bizarre double-edged sword. On one hand, it was another pair of eyes judging her, confirming her pitiable status.
On the other, it was the first evidence she had encountered that her suffering was being seen clearly, not filtered through the haze of gossip and shared prejudice. Julian wasn't engaging, he wasn't helping, but he was recording the truth of the events as they transpired, a silent stenographer of cruelty. The deepening despair in Alara was almost absolute. The future looked like an infinite stretch of this agonizing existence, punctuated only by brief, painful holidays. She found herself retreating even further into a mind, concocting elaborate mental escapes that were becoming dangerously real. The thought of simply walking away, disappearing from the town, the school, the entire narrative, became a constant siren-like temptation. She was at the very brink of the tipping point, where the sheer effort of existence outweighed the will to live. The school administration, meanwhile, remained conveniently blind. The guidance counselor, Mrs.
Albright, had held one obligatory meeting with Alara, following a note from a concerned but ultimately passive English teacher. The meeting was a disaster. Alara, so broken by the constant silence, found that when given a safe space to speak, her throat physically closed up. She could only sit there, mute, trembling slightly. Mrs. Albright, interpreting the silence as either sullen defiance or worse, confirming evidence of the vague, insidious rumor that had poisoned the class, something about Alara being unstable, volatile, and prone to fabrication, concluded the session with a saccharine smile and a recommendation for better integration strategies and taking ownership of her social challenges. The irony was a physical ache in Alara's chest. The system was designed to protect the collective comfort, not the marginalized truth.
The atmosphere escalated sharply in the week leading up to the school's annual Community Spirit Assembly, a mandatory event meant to celebrate togetherness, which for Alara meant mandatory public isolation. Vanessa, sensing Alara's fragility and recognizing the high visibility of the event, decided to orchestrate the final, crushing blow. The school required every student to submit a small piece of personal work for a display board, meant to showcase the unique tapestry of our student body. Alara, in a moment of desperate, naive hope that she could communicate something pure and true, submitted a small, intricately folded origami crane, fashioned from blue textured paper she had saved for months. It was a symbol of hope and peace, a tiny, fragile offering. When the display board was unveiled in the main hallway the day before the assembly, the piece was there, but it was not hanging with the others.
The blue crane had been carefully placed inside a cheap, clear Ziploc sandwich bag. The bag was affixed directly below the main display, stuck to the plaster with a piece of aggressive silver duct tape, conspicuously separate. Next to the bag, someone, clearly Vanessa, though anonymously, had penned a small, neat sign on index card stock, reading, "Quarantine area. Caution. Handle with care." The effect was instantaneous, devastating, and complete. It wasn't just isolation. It was a public declaration that her very essence was contagious, a biohazard. Alara saw it during the morning rush. The crowd parted around the sign, giggling nervously, pointing. The humor was cruel, but the execution was brilliant in its simplicity. It achieved maximum humiliation with zero traceable violence. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. Her vision narrowed to the duct tape, the shiny plastic of the bag, the pathetic, tiny blue crane trapped inside. This was the end.
There was no recovery from this level of systematic, institutionalized cruelty that the school had implicitly sanctioned through its sheer tolerance. She didn't cry. Crying was a weakness, a performance they expected. Instead, a cold, frightening clarity settled over her. She knew, with chilling certainty, that she could not face the assembly the next day. She could not face another minute of this shared, hostile oxygen. She turned on a heel, her breath catching in her throat, and fled. She didn't bother grabbing her backpack from her locker, which contained all her textbooks and assignments, the very shield she had used to fend off the madness. She just ran, blindly, the sound of the corridor laughter fading behind her, until there was only the pounding of her own desperate heart. She ran past the main office, past the gymnasium where the assembly stage was already being set up, and burst through the heavy fire doors leading out into the weak autumn sunshine. As she vanished around the corner of the parking lot, swallowed by the wide, empty landscape beyond the school grounds, the camera mounted discreetly on the roof corner of the media center continued its slow, mechanical sweep, capturing the emptiness. Back inside the now quiet hallway, the traffic of students having thinned, Julian emerged from the shadow of a trophy case. His face remained neutral, his expression impossible to read. He walked slowly toward the quarantine area sign. He didn't touch the bag or the crane, but his eyes moved back and forth between the cruel note and the blue symbol of failed hope. Julian reached into the pocket of his oversized jacket and pulled out a small, specialized cell phone. Not a standard smartphone, but a rugged device with a high-resolution camera lens, and took several rapid, detailed photographs of the setup, the crane, the tape, the sign, the location. He then pulled out a spiral notebook, flipped past pages filled with meticulously detailed sketches of human interactions, diagrams of seating arrangements, timelines of ignored questions, and flowcharts tracking the trajectory of disdainful glances, and made a final, decisive notation. He looked briefly in the direction Alara had fled, then back at the exposed display, the quiet witness to the final act of public degradation. The observation phase, Julian thought with a strange, cold conviction, was finally complete. Everything required for the next step was now in place. He zipped his jacket and walked toward the staff entrance, his steps suddenly focused, purposeful. The passive recorder of history was about to become its active editor. The silence had served its purpose, documenting the absolute lowest point. The changing narrative was now inevitable, but it would not be Alara who wielded the power to change it.
It would be the meticulous record-keeper and the vast, unknown contents of that heavy, spiral-bound notebook. The air in the administrative conference room was a heavy, suffocating blanket, woven from institutional dread and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. It was not a room designed for comfort, but for consequence. The unforgiven fluorescent light casting harsh, revealing shadows on every anxious face. Alara sat perfectly still at the center of the mahogany table, flanked by the stern, impassive figures of Principal Thompson and the head of discipline, Miss Albright. Facing her were Chloe, the undisputed architect of her social ruin, flanked by her two loyal lieutenants, their expressions a carefully calibrated mix of feigned righteousness and barely concealed panic. The rest of the class, represented by a rotating committee of students who had all, at various times, thrown their stones, occupied the back rows, shifting restlessly, their collective anticipation a palpable, sickening thrum. This was the crescendo, the moment everyone, the accusers, the accused, and the indifferent witnesses, knew the final verdict would be rendered, defining not just Alara's future, but the moral integrity of the entire institution. Chloe, emboldened by weeks of unchallenged authority and the silent complicity of nearly 70% of their peers, leaned forward, her voice resonating with a practiced sincerity that was chilling in its perfection. She revisited the manufactured narrative one last time, detailing with forensic precision how Alara had supposedly fabricated evidence of her participation in the charity drive, undermining the efforts of the genuine organizers and bringing shame upon the school's reputation.
It wasn't just dishonesty, Principal Thompson, Chloe asserted, placing a binder of meticulously fabricated testimonials on the table. It was calculated cruelty. She isolated herself, and when she couldn't rejoin us, she tried to tear down the good we had achieved. Every eye swung to Alara, expecting the breakdown, the tears, the desperate, futile defense they had watched crumble over the preceding months. But Alara did not break. She simply met Chloe's gaze, her own eyes steady, deep, and unnervingly calm, the silence stretching out until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone's chests. It was in this moment, this agonizing, extended pause, that the first crack appeared in the solid facade of the accuser's confidence. It was the realization that the victim they had collectively tortured was no longer playing the part assigned to her. The submissive gaze was gone, replaced by a clarity that hinted at knowledge far deeper than anyone present possessed. This stoicism, far from being surrender, felt like the coiled energy before a spring release. Then, Mr. Harrison, the unassuming history teacher, who had quietly observed the social demolition from the periphery, cleared his throat. He had been a ghost in the background, ostensibly just an impartial faculty witness. Now, he gently pushed a small aluminum laptop across the polished table toward Principal Thompson. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried more weight than any shouted accusation. "Before we review Miss Denton's final report, Principal," Harrison said, his voice measured and quiet, forcing everyone to strain to hear, "I would like to present a supplemental document, something I located after reviewing the digital infrastructure logs following the initial reports of discrepancy." Principal Thompson, a man who prided himself on procedural rigor, gave a curt, impatient nod. He opened the laptop. The room watched the screen illuminate, bathing the principal's face in a cold blue light. What followed was not a simple image or a single document, but a devastatingly precise sequence of events, laid bare through network metadata and forensic digital timestamps. The screen displayed a granular timeline. It showed not only the original data entry for the charity drive, but also the exact moments when the data was accessed remotely, the specific IP addresses used, and the precise keystrokes that deleted, manipulated, and reinserted falsified participation records, all done under Alara's login credentials.
Crucially, the timeline included the network trace that linked the remote access not to Alara's dorm room, but to an anonymous proxy that, when cross-referenced against school security data, consistently traced back to a specific subnet within Chloe's family estate, a network used exclusively by her highly customized gaming rig, a rig that she had bragged about having secure, untraceable access through. The room gasped. It wasn't a loud collective shout, but a rush of expelled air, the sound of 70 people simultaneously realizing the profound, terrifying mistake they had made. The sheer, overwhelming complexity of the evidence was proof enough. This wasn't a girl defensively trying to cover her tracks. This was a surgical, highly sophisticated act of digital sabotage designed to frame her, requiring planning, patience, and access that only the wealthy and technologically savvy could orchestrate. The initial accusation that Alara had simply lied about signing up was reduced to a pathetic, flimsy cover story, now exposed as the cruel prelude to a far more sinister plot. The color, which had only slightly receded from Chloe's face earlier, now drained entirely, leaving her looking skeletal, hollowed out by sudden visceral panic. Her hands, resting demurely in her lap, began to tremble uncontrollably, a tiny, localized earthquake, visible only to the people closest to the table. She tried to speak,
but only a dry, rattling noise escaped her throat. The realization hit her. The realization that her pride, her perceived untouchability, had blinded her to the possibility of genuine technical investigation, and she had built her throne upon a lie that was now dissolving under the harsh scrutiny of irrefutable digital truth.
Albright, the head of discipline, who had harbored private doubts about the speed and intensity of the class's unanimous condemnation of Elira, slowly reached out and placed her hand over the laptop, signifying the end of the presentation. The metadata confirms not only the fraudulent alteration of school records, but also the systematic collection of student information used to fabricate the supporting testimonials against Miss Elira Vance, Albright stated, her voice low and edged with profound disappointment. The extent of this manipulation suggests weeks, possibly months, of concerted effort to isolate and destroy Miss Vance's standing within this community. The evidence is conclusive. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. The students in the back rows looked down at their shoes, avoiding eye contact, desperate to melt into the woodwork. They had been manipulated, yes, but they had also been complicit.
They had chosen the easy path of groupthink, the comfortable safety of joining the powerful majority, rather than exercising the simple, difficult muscle of skepticism. Each student who had laughed at a joke about Elira, or pointedly ignored her in the hallway, or refused to sit near her in the cafeteria, felt the cold spike of shame pierce their self-righteous bubble. They hadn't just bullied a girl. They had participated in the character assassination of an innocent person based on rumors and spite, all because it was convenient and served the social order established by Chloe. Principal Thompson, whose reputation rested on the supposed fairness and integrity of the school environment, finally shut the laptop with a decisive click that echoed like a gunshot. His voice, when it came, was stripped of all professional warmth, replaced by a cold institutional fury. Miss Denton, Miss Thorne, Mr. Keller. He addressed Chloe and her two shattered accomplices.
The premeditated nature and scope of this conspiracy exceed the parameters of standard disciplinary infractions. This is not simply a matter of academic dishonesty. This is a criminal level of harassment and data manipulation. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending expulsion. The school board will be convening an emergency session tonight to review the full details, and I assure you, the maximum institutional penalties will be sought. The pronouncement was absolute. Chloe didn't even argue. As she was escorted out, flanked by the security detail that had suddenly appeared, her veneer finally cracked completely. She wasn't defiant or angry. She was a terrified wreck, stumbling, occasionally looking back at the seated class, not with malice, but with a bewildered sense of betrayal. Where were her allies now? They sat immobile, horrified witnesses to the downfall of their monarch. Then the focus shifted entirely.
Principal Thompson turned his gaze to the remaining students, the majority who had willingly participated in the cruelty. He didn't yell. He spoke with a quiet, cut-and gravity that demanded attention. "To the rest of you," he said, sweeping his hand across the hushed assembly, "what happened here today is a stain on this school's history. You were presented with a narrative, and you accepted it without question, allowing convenience and fear to dictate your moral compass. You ostracized, you ridiculed, and you contributed to the severe psychological distress of one of your own, based on malicious lies." He paused, letting the magnitude of their collective failure settle. "The immediate social structure of this class is dissolved. For the next 3 weeks, your curriculum will be entirely devoted to ethics, digital responsibility, and the psychology of group complicity."
Every single one of you will write a detailed, unsparing account of your participation or lack thereof in the marginalization of Miss Vance. These reports will not be graded.
They will be evidence of your capacity for self-reflection and accountability. If you can't look inward and recognize the damage you inflicted through silence and participation, then you have learned nothing, and this institution has failed you. The class filed out, heads bowed, burdened not by fear of punishment, but by a crushing wave of guilt. They walked past Alara, now standing alone at the table. None dared meet her eyes. The power dynamic was irrevocably inverted. She wasn't the pariah. She was the unflinching mirror reflecting their own ugliness back at them. The truth had not just exonerated her. It had delivered a profound, searing moral judgment on the entire cohort. Alara finally gathered her things, her hands moving with quiet, deliberate dignity. Mr.
Harrison approached her, not offering pity, but respect. "I knew they were building something cruel," he murmured, his eyes kind. "But the complexity of the digital footprint shocked even me. You were incredibly brave, Alara, to endure that silence." Alara finally allowed a small, tired smile to touch her lips. "I knew the truth was bigger than their rumors, Mr. Harrison. It's hard to fight a lie when everyone wants to believe it, but eventually facts become inconvenient, and their inconvenience became their undoing." She understood that her composure had been her weapon. While they expected histrionics, she provided stoicism, forcing them to look harder, until the one person capable of finding the digital ghost in the machine finally did. The consequences for Chloe and her circle were immediate and public. Expulsion was swift, accompanied by a formal police investigation into potential cybercrime and harassment charges.
The fallout resonated through the elite social circles of the city, becoming a cautionary tale about the misuse of privilege and the arrogance of presumed anonymity. But the most profound change was the reformation at a classroom itself. The social hierarchy, which had been rigid and oppressive, was shattered beyond repair. Trust was annihilated. Students now looked at each other with suspicion, wondering who and who among was capable of such venomous complicity. The subsequent 3 weeks of mandatory ethical review were agonizing, forcing genuine, raw conversations that had previously been suppressed by fear of social retribution. Friendships dissolved. New tentative alliances based on mutual disillusionment began to form. The class was broken, yes, but in that fracture, a fragile new foundation for genuine connection, one built on accountability, not popularity, was being laid.
Elira Vance, the girl they had tried to erase, became the axis around which the entire community was forced to rotate and redefine itself. She did not seek revenge, nor did she bask in their belated, awkward apologies. Instead, she chose a path of quiet strength. She finished the school year with exceptional grace, but she chose not to return. The environment, though cleansed of the immediate poison, was too heavy with the memory of betrayal. She accepted an offer from a prestigious academy in another state, a place where her past was unknown, and her future could be built entirely on her own merit, unburdened by the prejudice of others. Her departure was low-key, but her effect was permanent.
The story of Alara became an institutional myth, whispered in hallways, not a tale of victimhood, but a sharp reminder that truth, however slow, will eventually excavate the darkest lies, and that silence in the face of injustice is never neutrality. It is complicity, and complicity always carries the heaviest toll. The poor girl they turned against had not been broken. She had simply been forged in the fire of their cruelty, emerging stronger and clearer than any of them. And that truly was what changed everything. The class learned a lesson that no textbook could teach. The easiest path is often the most morally bankrupt, and the systems we rely on for protection can sometimes only be triggered by the unwavering dignity of the unjustly accused. If you found the profound depth of this narrative compelling
and felt the weight of the moral judgment leveled against the perpetrators? Make sure to share your thoughts.
What part of the confrontation resonated most strongly with your sense of justice? Did the class receive the level of accountability they deserved? Leave your comments below and let us know what similar stories of ultimate vindication deserve to be told next.